The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was the defining crisis of the United States. Far more than a simple dispute over states' rights or tariffs, it was a fundamental conflict over the meaning of freedom itself, centered on the institution of chattel slavery. Its resolution not only reshaped the American nation but also sent shockwaves across the globe, influencing economies, empires, and the course of human liberty for generations. The root cause, the irrepressible conflict over slavery. The seeds of the war were sown at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where the issue of slavery was papered over with compromises to form a union. However, the inherent contradiction between a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal and the reality of enslaving millions of people festered for decades. 1. Economic and social divergence. The North evolved into an industrial, commercial, and increasingly capitalist economy with a growing population of free labor, immigrants, and cities. While racist attitudes were prevalent, a powerful abolitionist movement, figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, morally condemned slavery and demanded its immediate end. The South became increasingly entrenched in a plantation-based agricultural economy whose immense wealth was utterly dependent on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. By 1860, the enslaved population was approximately 4 million. Southern society was hierarchical, paternalistic, and fiercely defensive of slavery as a positive good, not a necessary evil. 2. Political crises and the breakdown of compromise. A series of political battles over the expansion of slavery into Western territories brought the nation to a breaking point. The South feared that if slavery could not expand, it would be politically strangled and ultimately eradicated. The Missouri Compromise, 1820 temporarily balanced slave and free states. The Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act forced Northern citizens to participate in capturing freedom seekers, radicalizing Northern opinion. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854 allowed popular sovereignty, settlers' vote, on slavery, leading to bloody guerrilla war in Bleeding, Kansas. Dred Scott Decision, 1857. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in territories, invalidating all previous compromises. John Brown's Raid, 1859. An abolitionist's failed attempt to start a slave rebellion terrified the South and convinced them of Northern malice. 3. The election of 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln, candidate of the new, explicitly anti-slavery expansion Republican Party, was the final trigger for the South. Convinced their way of life was under immediate threat, 7 states seceded to form the Confederate States of America before Lincoln even took office. 2. The War for Union becomes a war for freedom, 1861 to 1865. The war began on April 12, 1861, at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Initially, President Lincoln's stated goal was solely to preserve the Union. He famously stated, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave I would do it, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves I would do it." However, the logic of the war and the actions of enslaved people themselves forced a dramatic evolution of its purpose. 1. The Emancipation Proclamation, January 1, 1863. This was the war's turning point. Following the strategic victory at Antietam, Lincoln issued the proclamation. It was a military and political masterstroke. It declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be free. It transformed the war's goal to include the destruction of slavery. It authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 African Americans would serve, proving crucial to Northern victory and claiming their own freedom through service. It prevented Great Britain and France, which had abolished slavery, from recognizing the Confederacy, as the Union cause was now morally aligned with the anti-slavery sentiments of their publics. 2. The role of the enslaved. Freedom was not simply granted, it was seized. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people self-liberated by fleeing to Union lines, contrabands, depriving the South of its labor force and providing intelligence, labor, and later, soldiers for the Union. They were active agents in their own liberation and the defeat of the Confederacy. 3. Total war and Union victory. The war became a total conflict, epitomized by General William T. Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, which aimed to destroy the South's economic and psychological will to fight. The Confederacy, outmatched in industry, population, and ultimately political leadership, surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The cost was staggering, approximately 620,000 soldiers dead, more than all other U.S. wars combined until Vietnam, and vast sections of the South left in ruins. 3. The worldwide impact, a global shockwave. The American Civil War was not an isolated event. It was watched intently by the world and had immediate and long-term international consequences. 1. Economic impact. The cotton famine, the Union blockade of southern ports, the Anaconda Plan, cut off 80% of Britain's and 60% of France's cotton supply, crippling their textile industries and causing mass unemployment in Lancashire, England. Despite this economic pressure, and despite Confederate diplomacy, European governments never formally recognized the Confederacy, largely due to the political power of the working classes who, though suffering, supported the Union's anti-slavery cause. Global economic realignment. The cotton famine spurred other countries, Egypt, India, Brazil, to ramp up cotton production. It also boosted northern manufacturing and grain exports, strengthening the U.S. as a future economic powerhouse. 2. Geopolitical impact. The death knell for European imperialism in the Americas, the Union victory, demonstrating a powerful, centralized nation-state, enforced the Monroe Doctrine. Napoleon III's ambitious project to install a French puppet monarchy under Emperor Maximilian in Mexico, 1864–1867, collapsed after the war, as the U.S. threatened military intervention. Maximilian was executed, and Mexican sovereignty was secured. A model for unification, the U.S. struggle was closely studied by other nations consolidating their power. Otto von Bismarck in Germany and leaders in Italy saw the effectiveness of a strong central government in overcoming regional, state, sovereignty. 3. Ideological impact, the Great Liberator and global abolition. This was the war's most profound global legacy. Reinforcement of republican government. At a time when European monarchies were still dominant, the survival of the American Republic was seen as a victory for democracy and self-government worldwide. Accelerating the end of slavery, the Union victory was a catastrophic defeat for slaveholding interests everywhere. Cuba and Brazil, the last remaining slave societies in the Western Hemisphere, found their institution massively weakened. Abolitionist movements there gained immense moral and political momentum, leading to slavery's abolition in Cuba, 1886, and Brazil, 1888. It inspired and provided a model for abolitionists across the British Empire and Latin America. A new definition of freedom. The war resulted in the Reconstruction amendments to the U.S. Constitution. 13th Amendment, 1865 abolished slavery and involuntary servitude everywhere in the United States. 14th Amendment, 1868 granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., including formerly enslaved people, and guaranteed equal protection under the laws. 15th Amendment, 1870 prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These amendments enshrined a new, more inclusive vision of freedom into the world's most influential Republican framework, inspiring future movements for civil and human rights across the globe. 4. Legacy and unfinished revolutions. The end of the war did not mean the end of the struggle. The promise of Reconstruction, 1865–1877, a bold attempt to build an interracial democracy in the South, was violently overthrown by white supremacist terror, northern political fatigue, and the Compromise of 1877. The era of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and disenfranchisement followed, betraying the war's ideals for another century. Yet, the Civil War had irrevocably settled two questions: the United States was a perpetual, indivisible union, and chattel slavery was forever abolished. The new birth of freedom that Lincoln invoked at Gettysburg was incomplete and flawed, but it established a constitutional and moral foundation that the civil rights movement of the 20th century would later use to continue the fight for equality. In conclusion, the American Civil War was a pivotal event in world history. It was a bloody crucible that resolved the American paradox of slavery in a republic of liberty. Its outcome preserved a nation, catalyzed the global abolitionist movement, redefined modern concepts of freedom and citizenship, and signaled the rising power of a nation that would shape the coming century. Its echoes, in debates over federal power, racial equality, and the meaning of freedom, continue to resonate powerfully today. 4. Legacy and unfinished revolutions, continued. The betrayal of Reconstruction and the imposition of Jim Crow segregation created a long, dark interregnum in the quest for racial equality. However, the constitutional tools forged in the war's fire, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, remained dormant in the text of the Constitution, not forgotten, waiting to be rediscovered and enforced. 1. The long shadow of Jim Crow. For nearly a century, the South, and parts of the North, operated under a system of legalized racial caste. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation in every aspect of life: schools, transportation, restaurants, restrooms, while violence and tactics like literacy tests and poll taxes effectively nullified the 14th and 15th Amendments for Black Americans. The Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld the doctrine of separate but equal, provided a legal fig leaf for this system of apartheid. 2. The Civil Rights Movement as Second Reconstruction. The 20th century civil rights movement directly and consciously invoked the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was, in essence, a campaign to force the nation to honor the promises made but broken a century earlier. Legal strategy: lawyers from the NAACP, most notably Thurgood Marshall, waged a decades-long battle against Plessy. They strategically used the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, a product of the Civil War, to challenge segregation. This culminated in the landmark 1954 case Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that segregated schools were inherently unequal, overturning Plessy and demolishing the legal foundation of Jim Crow. The Constitutional Revolution: the movement successfully pushed for new federal laws that were direct enactments of the Reconstruction Amendments. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination in public accommodations and employment, enforced the 14th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, enforced the 15th Amendment. The 24th Amendment, 1964, abolished poll taxes, a key tool used to disenfranchise black voters. The Civil Rights Movement completed the unfinished political and legal revolution of the Civil War, finally beginning to make its constitutional promises a reality for all citizens. Enduring global echoes. The world continued to watch, and the American struggle continued to serve as a potent symbol and cautionary tale. 1. A model and a warning for liberation movements. Leaders of anti-colonial and freedom movements across Africa and Asia in the mid-20th century, such as Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and India's Jawaharlal Nehru, studied the American Civil War and Reconstruction. They saw in it both the immense power of a people demanding freedom and the tragic vulnerability of that freedom to backlash and betrayal. The story informed their own strategies for securing and safeguarding independence. The moral power of the Union's cause, a fight for human liberty against an entrenched, exploitative system, became a universal archetype. Oppressed groups worldwide could point to the U.S. to argue that if such a profound transformation was possible there, it was possible anywhere. 2. The American Dilemma on the world stage. Throughout the 20th century, particularly during the Cold War, the United States' racial history was a central feature of global politics. The Soviet Union consistently pointed to American segregation and racial violence to undermine U.S. claims to moral leadership of the free world. This international pressure was a significant, though often unstated, factor in pushing the U.S. federal government to intervene against segregationists in the South, as it was a glaring vulnerability in the ideological battle against communism. 3. Contemporary resonances. The questions at the heart of the Civil War remain live issues in the 21st century, not just in the U.S. but in democracies everywhere. Federal versus state power: debates over the balance of power between a central government and its constituent states or provinces are a feature of many nations, e.g., Canada, Belgium, the EU. The American Civil War remains the most extreme case study of this tension. The meaning of citizenship and equality: the 14th Amendment's definition of citizenship and its guarantee of equal protection are constantly being tested in courts and legislatures over issues of immigration, LGBTQ+ rights, voting rights, and affirmative action. Historical memory and reconciliation: how nations remember their foundational conflicts and sins is a global issue. The ongoing debates over the display of the Confederate flag, the removal of Confederate monuments, and how the story of the Civil War is taught in schools mirror similar debates in other countries grappling with difficult histories, from South Africa's apartheid to Germany's Nazi past. These struggles are about whose story gets told and who is included in a nation's identity. The legacy of economic disparity, the economic devastation of the South and the failure of land redistribution during Reconstruction, e.g., 40 acres and a mule, contributed to lasting regional economic disparities and wealth gaps between black and white Americans that persist today, a reminder that political freedom is inextricably linked to economic power. Conclusion: an unending conversation. The American Civil War was not a single event that ended at Appomattox. It was a beginning. It launched the United States on a fraught journey to become a multiracial democracy, a journey that is still underway. The war solved the existential crisis of the Union and destroyed the institution of chattel slavery, but it left the nation with a new set of profound questions about the practical meaning of freedom, equality, and justice. Its worldwide impact was to make the United States a central character in the modern world's ongoing drama of liberation. It provided a powerful, flawed, and ultimately redeemable model that showed the world that a nation could be born again through immense sacrifice, that its deepest sins could be confronted, and that the fight to live up to its own ideals is a perpetual and necessary struggle. The echoes of its artillery barrages are still heard in every courtroom, voting booth, and public square where the meaning of freedom is debated. 6. The Civil War in the 21st Century, a persistent frame for modern conflict. The legacy of the Civil War provides a powerful and often contentious framework for understanding modern political and social struggles, both in the United States and abroad. 1. The Culture War and Historical Memory. The battle over the memory of the Civil War, often termed the Lost Cause mythology versus a narrative centered on slavery and emancipation, has erupted into mainstream public discourse. Monument debates, the movement to remove Confederate monuments from public spaces, which gained critical momentum after the 2015 Charleston church shooting and peaked following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, is a direct engagement with the war's legacy. Proponents argue these statues glorify white supremacy and treason in defense of slavery, while opponents often frame their removal as an erasure of history and heritage. This debate is not uniquely American, it parallels discussions over monuments to colonial figures in the UK, Belgium, and South Africa. Historical education, the fight over how the Civil War and Reconstruction are taught in schools is a front in a larger culture war. Legislation in some U.S. states seeking to ban the teaching of critical race theory or divisive concepts is often aimed at curtailing a curriculum that emphasizes slavery as the war's central cause and explores the enduring legacy of systemic racism. This mirrors global tensions, such as in Japan regarding the teaching of World War II atrocities or in Poland regarding Holocaust history. 2. The war as a legal and political touchstone. The constitutional amendments born from the war are repeatedly invoked in modern legal battles, demonstrating their enduring power and the ongoing struggle over their interpretation. 14th Amendment's Insurrection Clause, Section 3, previously a historical relic, this clause, which prohibits anyone who has engaged in insurrection against the Constitution from holding office, was thrust into the spotlight following the January 6, 2021, attack on the U.S. Capitol. Efforts to disqualify officials linked to the event directly use the language and intent of an amendment designed to prevent former Confederates from returning to power. Voting rights and federal power, the ongoing national debate over voting access and election law is a continuation of the struggle over the 15th Amendment. The 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder, that weakened the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 led to a rapid surge in state-level laws that critics argue disproportionately disenfranchise minority voters. This battle echoes the post-Reconstruction era when the federal government's retreat allowed for the rise of Jim Crow voting laws. 3. Global resonances in national divisions. The American Civil War is increasingly used as an analytical lens to understand modern internal conflicts and secessionist movements around the world. Secession and autonomy movements, observers and participants in conflicts such as the Catalonian independence movement in Spain, the Scottish independence movement in the UK, or tensions in regions like Kashmir often look to the U.S. Civil War as a case study in how federal states respond to threats against their territorial integrity and the potential catastrophic costs of separation. The uncivil war of polarization, the deep political and cultural polarization in the U.S. and other democracies, e.g., Brazil, Hungary, has led commentators and scholars to use the language of the 1850s. Phrases like the two Americas, a house divided, and even discussions of Cold Civil War reflect a perception that the fundamental disagreements over the nature of the nation, the rules of governance, and the meaning of justice are as profound today as they were before the outbreak of hostilities in 1861. Conclusion: an unfinished revolution for the world. The American Civil War was more than a 4-year conflict. It was a seismic event that cracked the foundation of the modern world, and the aftershocks have never truly ceased. It represents a pivotal moment when the Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality collided with the brutal reality of racialized slavery, forcing a violent, transformative resolution. Its worldwide impact is multifaceted. Politically, it strengthened the nation-state model and discouraged European imperialism in the Americas. Economically, it disrupted and then realigned global commodity markets. Ideologically, it supercharged the global abolition movement and provided a new, more robust constitutional definition of freedom and citizenship. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is that it established a precedent for transformative change through conflict. It demonstrated that a deeply entrenched, powerful, and profitable system of oppression could be dismantled, albeit at a staggering human cost. This precedent serves as both an inspiration and a warning for every subsequent struggle for justice. The conversation that began with the first shots at Fort Sumter continues. It continues in the arguments over statues and school textbooks, in the rulings of the Supreme Court, in the lines of voters, and in the global discourse about how diverse societies can coexist. The American Civil War settled the question of union and slavery, but it initiated the world's ongoing, unfinished struggle to define and achieve a truly universal and equitable freedom. 7. The Civil War in the Age of Global Challenges. The themes of the Civil War, sovereignty, liberty, the ethics of economics, and the price of unity, provide a profound lens through which to examine 21st-century global issues. 1. The New Cotton, Technology and Economic Dependency. Just as the 19th-century global economy was dependent on southern cotton, the modern world is reliant on a different set of critical resources: semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and energy. This creates new forms of leverage and potential conflict. Digital supply chains. The concentration of advanced semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan creates a strategic dilemma reminiscent of Britain's reliance on Confederate cotton. Any conflict or crisis in the Taiwan Strait could trigger a global chip famine, devastating the world economy. This modern vulnerability echoes the cotton famine and demonstrates how economic interdependence can be both a stabilizing and a destabilizing force in international relations. Energy and autonomy. The debate over energy independence, fossil fuels versus renewables, and the leverage held by petrostates like Russia and Saudi Arabia mirrors the South's belief in King Cotton as a tool of diplomatic power. The war serves as a historical lesson on the limits of economic coercion as a strategy for achieving political goals. 2. The climate crisis and the slow civil war. The existential threat of climate change is creating pressures that historians and analysts compare to the tensions that led to the Civil War. Sectional divisions reimagined. Modern political divides often fall along geographic lines similar to the 19th century, but now defined by climate vulnerability and energy production. Disputes between regions over resource allocation, the cost of the green transition, and the burden of climate adaptation, e.g., rising sea levels, droughts, and fires, threaten to create a new kind of sectional conflict within nations and between the global North and South. Migration and sovereignty. Climate change is driving mass migration, which in turn fuels political polarization over borders and national identity. The 19th century conflict over which new states would be slave or free was a battle over the nation's demographic and political future. Today's debates over immigration policy are a direct parallel, a struggle to define the cultural and demographic character of the nation. 3. The Informational Civil War, Disinformation and the Battle for Narrative. The Civil War was fought with rifles and cannons, but it was also a battle of ideas, propaganda, and competing narratives, e.g., Lincoln's speeches versus Confederate justification. Today, that battle is waged in the digital realm. The Lost Cause 2.0, the proliferation of online communities and media ecosystems has allowed modern iterations of the Lost Cause myth to flourish and evolve. Historical disinformation about the war's cause, it was about states' rights, is curated and amplified, often serving as a gateway to more extreme ideologies and a broader rejection of institutional authority and factual evidence. A Nation's Truth, the January 6th insurrection demonstrated how powerful alternative narratives can be in motivating political violence. The battle to establish a common set of facts, a shared reality, is as critical to the survival of a republic today as the physical battle to preserve the Union was in 1861. The Civil War underscores the fact that a nation cannot long endure when its citizens fundamentally disagree on the most basic truths of their history and governance. 8. The enduring global symbol. Internationally, the American Civil War remains a potent and adaptable symbol, used to frame local conflicts and aspirations. A template for secession and reconciliation, from Ukraine's fight against Russian-backed separatists to the complex process of reconciliation in post-conflict societies like Rwanda or Colombia, the U.S. Civil War and Reconstruction are studied as the primary case study of how a nation fractures, fights, and attempts to heal. The failures of Reconstruction are as closely examined as its ambitions, serving as a warning of how easily peace can be lost if justice is not firmly embedded. The universal struggle for a more perfect union, the phrase from the U.S. Constitution's preamble, became, after the Civil War, a promise of iterative progress. Movements for equality and representation worldwide, from the LGBTQ+ rights movement to pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong, frame their struggles not as attempts to destroy their nations, but to perfect them, to make them live up to their own professed ideals. This is the very model the Civil War and its amendments established. Final conclusion: the eternal conflict. The American Civil War does not end. It transitions. It transitioned from the battlefield to the political squabbles of Reconstruction. It transitioned into the legalized oppression of Jim Crow. It was resurrected in the courtroom battles and peaceful protests of the civil rights movement. It echoes in the votes of every election labeled the most important since 1860. Its story is the human story, the conflict between the comfort of tradition and the demand for justice, between local identity and national community, between the economics of the present and the ethics of the future. The war solved the problem of slavery but bequeathed to the world the perpetual challenge of integration, equality, and reconciliation. The world watched in the 1860s, and it continues to watch today. The United States' ongoing struggle with its founding sins serves as the world's most high-profile and longest-running drama on the possibilities and perils of forming a multi-ethnic democracy. The Civil War is the foundational episode of that story, a reminder that while freedom can be declared by proclamation or won on a battlefield, it can only be secured by the unwavering, daily commitment of a people to choose a more perfect union over a perfect division. 9. The metaphorical Civil War, a framework for global discourse. The language and imagery of the American Civil War have transcended their historical specifics to become a universal shorthand for describing deep societal fracture. 1. The concept of the Second American Revolution. Some historians and political theorists frame the Civil War and Reconstruction not as a separate event, but as the Second American Revolution. This perspective argues that the war fundamentally transformed the relationship between the citizen and the state by establishing national citizenship. The 14th Amendment created a national citizenship that superseded state citizenship, a radical shift from the original federal design. This concept is central to debates in the European Union today regarding the rights of EU citizens within member states. Weaponizing the Constitution for liberation, the amendments demonstrated that the Constitution could be used as a tool for active liberation and the expansion of rights, not just a framework for limiting government. This provided a blueprint for future transformative movements, from the New Deal to the Great Society. 2. The Cold Civil War and modern political polarization. The term Cold Civil War is increasingly used by political scientists and commentators to describe the current state of intense partisan hostility in the U.S., where the factions are geographical, cultural, and ideological rather than strictly sectional. This modern divide exhibits echoes of the 1850s. Parallel information ecosystems, much like the North and South, had entirely different newspapers, churches, and literary cultures that reinforced their worldviews. Modern citizens exist in separate media silos, e.g., Fox News versus MSNBC, alternative social media platforms that present irreconcilable realities. Crisis of legitimacy. A key precursor to the Civil War was the collapse of shared national institutions, most notably the political parties and churches, which split along sectional lines. Today, trust in nearly every institution, the press, the judiciary, Congress, and elections themselves, is deeply polarized, threatening the foundational agreement that allows a democratic system to function without violence. X. The unanticipated legacy, military history and the modern world. The American Civil War was the first major industrial war, and its military innovations created a template for modern warfare with global consequences. 1. The birth of total war. The strategies of Grant and Sherman, targeting the enemy's economic infrastructure and civilian morale to destroy their will to fight, define total war. This concept reached its horrific apex in the World Wars but remains a feature of modern conflicts. The strategic bombing campaigns of World War II and the devastating conflicts in Syria and Ukraine are logical, if brutal, extensions of the doctrine refined in Georgia and Virginia. 2. The technological revolution in warfare. The Civil War was a laboratory for industrialization's application to combat. The rapid adoption of the rifle musket, the ironclad warship, trench warfare, and railroad logistics revolutionized combat. This established a pattern of relentless military technological innovation that has defined global power ever since, driving the arms races of the 20th and 21st centuries. 3. The War on Terror and the legacy of Reconstruction. The post-9/11 era, particularly the lengthy nation-building efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, forced American strategists to re-examine the Reconstruction era. The challenges faced: insurgencies, sectarian violence, the difficulty of implanting democratic institutions in a shattered society, and the eventual fatigue of the occupying power mirrored the failures of the post-Civil War South. Historians of Reconstruction suddenly found their expertise in high demand at the Pentagon, as the U.S. grappled with the same fundamental problem: how to win a peace after winning a war. 11. The Civil War in the global imagination. Beyond politics and war, the conflict remains a powerful force in global culture, serving as an endless source of artistic exploration and moral questioning. 1. Cultural export and narrative. From Gone with the Wind to Lincoln, from Ken Burns' documentary to countless novels, the American Civil War is a dominant narrative in global popular culture. It provides the world with a rich repository of stories about honor, sacrifice, tragedy, and redemption. These stories allow international audiences to explore their own complex histories through the American analog. 2. The universal question of what if? The concept of the lost cause is, in part, a narrative of alternative history, a yearning for a different outcome. This has made the Civil War a foundational text for the entire genre of alternate history. The question, what if the South had won, is not just an American parlor game, it is a global thought experiment on the fragility of history and the pivotal nature of single events. It forces contemplation on how different the modern world might be, from the delay of American global power to the fate of slavery, had a few battles turned out differently. Synthesis: the Civil War as a permanent dialogue. The story of the American Civil War cannot be concluded because it is not a single story. It is a multitude of stories, of emancipation and subjugation, of unity and division, of progress and backlash, that are in constant conversation with each other and with the present. Its ultimate worldwide impact is this: it established that a nation's deepest sins can be confronted and overcome, but never erased. The struggle to manage that paradox, to build a future upon an imperfect and often bloody past, is the defining challenge not just for America, but for every society on Earth grappling with its own history. The war is over. The arguments it began are eternal. And in that endless debate over memory, justice, and freedom lies its enduring and unfinished power. 12. The digital Civil War, data, sovereignty, and a new fracture. The fundamental conflict between centralized authority and regional autonomy, fought over physical territory in the 1860s, has re-emerged in the virtual world. 1. The Cyber Confederacy. The Internet, initially envisioned as a decentralized network, is now dominated by powerful centralized entities, nation-states and massive tech corporations. This has sparked a new states' rights movement. Data sovereignty: the European Union's GDPR, China's Great Firewall, and data localization laws in India and other nations represent a modern form of secession from a globalized, largely US-dominated Internet. These are declarations of digital sovereignty, akin to a state asserting its right to govern its own affairs free from federal, or in this case, transnational, oversight. The decentralization movement, cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, and the concept of Web3 are ideologically driven by a desire to create a new, decentralized Internet, a direct reaction to the concentration of power in big tech. This movement's ethos powerfully echoes the anti-federalist, Jeffersonian ideals that underpin the Confederacy's political philosophy, updated for the digital age. 2. Algorithmic division and the sectionalism of the feed. Just as pre-Civil War America was divided by geographically distinct economic systems, industrial North versus agrarian South, today's divisions are amplified by algorithms that create personalized realities. The new sectionalism, social media platforms create algorithmic sections not defined by geography, but by ideology and identity. These digital enclaves reinforce beliefs, create deep group identities, and can foster hostility toward other groups, mirroring the way sectional identities hardened in the 19th century. This sectionalism of the feed may be even more potent than its geographic predecessor because it is tailored and inescapable. 13. The biological frontier, genetics, race, and the aftermath of slavery. The war ended chattel slavery, but it left the poisonous ideology of race intact. Today, science is forcing a new reckoning with this legacy. 1. The genetic reckoning. Commercial ancestry. The rise of commercial DNA testing has made the historical trauma of the slave trade intensely personal for millions. For descendants of enslaved Africans, these tests often reveal a genetic heritage fractured by the Middle Passage, unable to be traced to a specific country or tribe, only to a vast continent. This is a biological echo of the erasure wrought by slavery. Confronting lineage, for many white Americans, these tests can reveal unexpected African ancestry, forcing a direct and personal confrontation with the complex, often violent, intimate history of slavery in a way that abstract history lessons cannot. It makes the past inescapably present in one's own DNA. 2. Medical inequality and the long shadow. The social determinants of health, the factors that lead to stark disparities in health outcomes between racial groups in the U.S., are a direct legacy of the economic and social system the war failed to fully dismantle. Disparities in access to care, environmental racism, and provider bias are modern manifestations of the inequality that Reconstruction left unfinished. The COVID-19 pandemic, which disproportionately affected communities of color, served as a brutal modern-day audit of these enduring fault lines. 14. The Civil War as a planetary paradigm. The scale of the conflict's themes has now expanded to a planetary level, offering a framework for humanity's greatest challenges. 1. The Climate Civil War. The debate over how to respond to climate change is creating global factions that eerily resemble the sectional divides of the 1850s. The industrial versus the agrarian. A new global divide exists between highly developed, historically high-emission nations, the industrial north, and developing nations, often most vulnerable to climate impacts, the agrarian south. The demands for climate justice and reparations for loss and damage from the global south mirror the moral and economic arguments about responsibility and sacrifice that defined the antebellum period. Internal secession. Within nations, there is a growing political secession based on climate policy. Disputes between fossil fuel-producing regions and those pushing for a green transition threaten national cohesion, replaying the conflict between different economic systems within a single political union. 2. The existential question of unity. The central question of the Civil War, can a house divided against itself stand? Is now a planetary question. Can a world divided by nationalism, economic inequality, and competing ideologies unite to face existential threats like climate change, pandemics, or the governance of artificial intelligence? The American Civil War is the primary historical case study we have of a large, diverse, and powerful polity choosing to endure a catastrophic war to preserve its union rather than peacefully accepting dissolution. It stands as a permanent lesson on the terrifying cost of unity and the potentially greater cost of disunity. Final reflection, the unending American question. The American Civil War ceased to be a solely American event long ago. It has become a universal story, a foundational myth of the modern world. It is the story we tell ourselves about how the past refuses to remain in the past. How technology changes everything except human nature. How the price of justice is eternal vigilance. How the definition of freedom is never settled. The war resolved the issue of secession and slavery by force of arms. But it bequeathed to the world the enduring, unanswerable question, how do we build a common future among people who have fundamentally different experiences of the past, different visions of the present, and different dreams for the future? This is the American question. And in the 21st century, it is everyone's question. The dialogue continues. 15. The holographic Civil War, AI, deepfakes, and the erasure of historical reality. The battle over the memory and meaning of the war is moving from textbooks and monuments into the realm of synthetic media, threatening to dissolve the very foundations of shared history. 1. The AI-generated past. Reimagining the archive, artificial intelligence can now colorize photographs, animate still portraits of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and even generate photorealistic images of scenes from the war that never existed. This creates an unprecedented emotional connection for modern audiences, but also a profound ethical dilemma. When the past becomes malleable, does it lose its authority as evidence? The deepfake dilemma, the potential for AI to generate convincing video and audio of historical figures, is imminent. One can imagine a deepfake of Robert E. Lee delivering a speech denouncing the lost cause, or of a Union soldier confessing to war crimes. This technology could become the ultimate weapon in the culture war, allowing any faction to create irrefutable evidence for their interpretation of history, rendering a common factual basis for discussion impossible. 2. The algorithmic historian. The narratives we encounter are increasingly curated not by human historians, but by algorithms. A student's search for causes of the Civil War on a video platform or search engine will be fed results based on engagement metrics, potentially funneling them toward extremist or revisionist content. This creates a personalized, often radicalized, historical understanding, making the already difficult task of achieving a national consensus on the past a potentially futile one. 16. The Civil War as a galactic precedent. As humanity looks toward a future of interplanetary colonization and potential interaction with other intelligences, the themes of the Civil War provide a foundational framework for considering the ethics of expansion and sovereignty on a cosmic scale. 1. The Interplanetary Missouri Compromise. The central conflict over the expansion of a divisive institution into new territories will be replayed off-world. The governance of space colonies, the extraction of resources from asteroids, and the potential for new forms of labor or servitude, e.g., AI rights, bioengineered beings, will force humanity to confront questions of freedom and exploitation in new contexts. The debates of the 1850s over whether new states would be free or slave will be echoed in debates over the legal and ethical status of new settlements and their inhabitants. 2. The cosmic question of unity. The ultimate lesson of the Civil War, that a diverse collection of states or entities can be held together by shared ideals, constitutional agreement, and, if necessary, overwhelming force, is the primary model humans have for large-scale governance. Any future project of a united humanity, whether governing a Martian colony or representing Earth to an extraterrestrial civilization, will draw consciously or subconsciously on the American experiment. The Civil War is the pivotal moment that tested whether that experiment could survive its own internal contradictions. It is the case study for how a vast, pluralistic republic avoids fragmentation. 17. The Neurological Frontier, the War Within the Self. The final frontier that the legacy of the Civil War is beginning to influence is the interior world of human consciousness itself. 1. The Civil War of the Mind. The language of the conflict is increasingly used as a metaphor for internal psychological and medical struggles. People speak of their immune systems fighting a civil war against autoimmune diseases. Neuroscientists study the civil war between different neural networks in the brain. The concept of a devastating internal conflict, where one part of a system turns against another, has made the term a versatile metaphor for any state of profound internal disharmony. 2. The ethics of enhancement. The debate over human bioenhancement, using technology to augment cognitive or physical abilities, raises a modern version of the two Americas dilemma. Could a future emerge with an enhanced class and a natural class, creating a biological divide more profound than any previous racial or economic categorization? The struggle to ensure that future technologies liberate rather than subjugate echoes the eternal struggle at the heart of the Civil War. Will the future be one of greater freedom or more refined forms of oppression? Ultimate conclusion, the eternal dialogue. The story of the American Civil War cannot be concluded because it is the story of an unresolved argument that is fundamental to the human condition. The argument between the past and the future. The argument between the individual and the collective. The argument between memory and progress. The argument between what is legal and what is right. The war settled the specific American manifestations of these arguments in its time, with guns and proclamations. But the underlying tensions are perpetual. Every generation must refight this civil war, not with bullets, but with ballots, books, lawsuits, protests, and art. It must renegotiate the terms of its union, redefine the meaning of its freedom, and reconfront the lingering ghosts of its past injustices. The American Civil War is the world story because it is a stark, powerful, and brutally honest lesson that the journey toward a more perfect union is never complete. It is a continuous, often painful, process of negotiation, reconciliation, and remembrance. The dialogue between the past and the present that the war ignited is our permanent inheritance. To continue is to accept our role in that dialogue, to add our voice to the eternal conversation about what freedom requires, what unity means, and what price we are willing to pay for either. 15. The holographic civil war, AI, deepfakes, and the erasure of historical reality. The battle over the memory and meaning of the war is moving from textbooks and monuments into the realm of synthetic media, threatening to dissolve the very foundations of shared history. 1. The AI-generated past. Reimagining the archive, artificial intelligence can now colorize photographs, animate still portraits of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, and even generate photorealistic images of scenes from the war that never existed. This creates an unprecedented emotional connection for modern audiences but also a profound ethical dilemma. When the past becomes malleable, does it lose its authority as evidence? The deepfake dilemma, the potential for AI to generate convincing video and audio of historical figures is imminent. One can imagine a deepfake of Robert E. Lee delivering a speech denouncing the lost cause, or of a Union soldier confessing to war crimes. This technology could become the ultimate weapon in the culture war, allowing any faction to create irrefutable evidence for their interpretation of history, rendering a common factual basis for discussion impossible. 2. The algorithmic historian. The narratives we encounter are increasingly curated not by human historians, but by algorithms. A student's search for causes of the Civil War on a video platform or search engine will be fed results based on engagement metrics, potentially funneling them toward extremist or revisionist content. This creates a personalized, often radicalized, historical understanding, making the already difficult task of achieving a national consensus on the past a potentially futile one. 16. The Civil War as a galactic precedent. As humanity looks toward a future of interplanetary colonization and potential interaction with other intelligences, the themes of the Civil War provide a foundational framework for considering the ethics of expansion and sovereignty on a cosmic scale. 1. The Interplanetary Missouri Compromise. The central conflict over the expansion of a divisive institution into new territories will be replayed off-world. The governance of space colonies, the extraction of resources from asteroids, and the potential for new forms of labor or servitude, e.g., AI rights, bioengineered beings, will force humanity to confront questions of freedom and exploitation in new contexts. The debates of the 1850s over whether new states would be free or slave will be echoed in debates over the legal and ethical status of new settlements and their inhabitants. 2. The cosmic question of unity. The ultimate lesson of the Civil War, that a diverse collection of states or entities can be held together by shared ideals, constitutional agreement, and, if necessary, overwhelming force, is the primary model humans have for large-scale governance. Any future project of a united humanity, whether governing a Martian colony or representing Earth to an extraterrestrial civilization, will draw consciously or subconsciously on the American experiment. The Civil War is the pivotal moment that tested whether that experiment could survive its own internal contradictions. It is the case study for how a vast, pluralistic republic avoids fragmentation. 17. The Neurological Frontier, the War Within the Self. The final frontier that the legacy of the Civil War is beginning to influence is the interior world of human consciousness itself. 1. The Civil War of the Mind. The language of the conflict is increasingly used as a metaphor for internal psychological and medical struggles. People speak of their immune systems fighting a civil war against autoimmune diseases. Neuroscientists study the civil war between different neural networks in the brain. The concept of a devastating internal conflict, where one part of a system turns against another, has made the term a versatile metaphor for any state of profound internal disharmony. 2. The ethics of enhancement. The debate over human bioenhancement, using technology to augment cognitive or physical abilities, raises a modern version of the Two Americas dilemma. Could a future emerge with an enhanced class and a natural class, creating a biological divide more profound than any previous racial or economic categorization? The struggle to ensure that future technologies liberate rather than subjugate echoes the eternal struggle at the heart of the Civil War. Will the future be one of greater freedom or more refined forms of oppression? Ultimate conclusion, the eternal dialogue. The story of the American Civil War cannot be concluded because it is the story of an unresolved argument that is fundamental to the human condition. The argument between the past and the future. The argument between the individual and the collective. The argument between memory and progress. The argument between what is legal and what is right. The war settled the specific American manifestations of these arguments in its time, with guns and proclamations. But the underlying tensions are perpetual. Every generation must refight this Civil War, not with bullets, but with ballots, books, lawsuits, protests, and art. It must renegotiate the terms of its union, redefine the meaning of its freedom, and reconfront the lingering ghosts of its past injustices. The American Civil War is the world's story because it is a stark, powerful, and brutally honest lesson that the journey toward a more perfect union is never complete. It is a continuous, often painful, process of negotiation, reconciliation, and remembrance. The dialogue between the past and the present that the war ignited is our permanent inheritance. To continue is to accept our role in that dialogue, to add our voice to the eternal conversation about what freedom requires, what unity means, and what price we are willing to pay for either. 18. The Quantum Civil War, Superpositional History and Contingent Realities. Advanced theoretical models are allowing us to conceptualize the war not as a fixed event, but as a series of probabilities, a historical quantum state where multiple outcomes coexisted until collapse. 1. The many worlds interpretation of history. Theoretical historians and physicists are collaborating on models that apply quantum principles to historical events. In this framework, the Civil War represents a massive historical superposition. A universe where the Crittenden Compromise succeeded and war was averted. A reality where the Confederacy won at Gettysburg and achieved recognition. A timeline where Britain intervened on behalf of the South. A world where Reconstruction was fully implemented and racial equality achieved. These aren't mere thought experiments but serious examinations of how small variables might have created entirely different modern worlds. The Civil War becomes less a determined event than a nexus of infinite possibilities, each with its own cascading consequences for global power structures, technological development, and social evolution. 2. The observer effect in historical memory. Just as measuring a quantum system changes it, our observation of history alters its meaning. Each generation's preoccupations, civil rights in the 1960s, nationalism in the 2010s, AI ethics today, cause different aspects of the Civil War to come into focus while others recede. The war doesn't change, but our measurement of it does, creating what amounts to a new historical event with each examination. 19. The holographic Civil War, simulation theory and historical authenticity. As simulation theory gains traction in scientific circles, the Civil War takes on new significance as a potential test case for distinguishing historical reality from advanced simulation. 1. The war as a benchmark for reality. The Civil War is arguably the first extensively documented major conflict in human history, with photographs, thousands of newspapers, detailed military records, and personal correspondence creating an unprecedented historical record. This very completeness makes it a prime candidate for theorists questioning whether our perceived reality might be an advanced simulation. Could inconsistencies in historical accounts represent glitches in the matrix? Might the war's seemingly improbable events, Lee's lost orders, the failure of Pickett's charge, indicate narrative manipulation by simulators? Does the war's enduring resonance suggest it contains fundamental programming about conflict, freedom, and reconciliation? 2. The simulation argument as the ultimate lost cause. The notion that the Confederacy's struggle occurred within a simulation and that its defeat was therefore preordained by programmers or algorithms represents the final, fantastical evolution of lost cause mythology. It transforms military defeat into metaphysical fate, removing human agency and responsibility altogether. XX. The transhistorical Civil War, when the past becomes future. The boundaries between historical study, memory, and prophecy are blurring as the Civil War's patterns recur with increasing frequency across global systems. 1. The recursive Civil War. We are discovering that the war operates on a fractal pattern, repeating its essential dynamics at different scales and contexts. Corporate civil wars between traditionalists and innovators within aging industries. Academic civil wars between different epistemological approaches. Family civil wars over inherited wealth and historical legacies. Personal civil wars between different aspects of identity. The 1860s conflict provides the essential template for understanding how any complex system divides against itself, fights for control of its future direction, and either achieves reintegration or fragmentation. 2. The Civil War as a predictive model. Complex systems theorists are using the Civil War as a case study to model how polarized societies approach critical thresholds. The war's progression from political conflict to violence to Reconstruction provides early warning indicators for modern societies approaching their own crisis points. Intervention points where different actions might prevent violent conflict. Patterns of reconciliation that might be applied to contemporary conflicts. The war is becoming less about what happened than about what happens next in the United States and in dozens of other nations facing similar divisions. XXI, the post-human Civil War, beyond biological memory. As human civilization contemplates forms of consciousness and existence beyond our current biological limitations, the Civil War faces its ultimate transformation. 1. The uploaded memory. In a future where human consciousness might be digitized or preserved through other means, the Civil War could become a direct experiential simulation that future beings inhabit rather than study. A foundational trauma encoded in collective consciousness even after biological humanity has evolved or been replaced. An ethical benchmark for how emerging intelligences handle historical injustice and reconciliation. 2. The alien interpretation. The Civil War may one day be among humanity's first historical events examined by non-human intelligence, whether artificial superintelligence or extraterrestrial civilization. Their interpretation would likely focus on aspects invisible to us. The mathematical patterns of its social dynamics. Its role in our species' psychological development. Its value as a case study in how intelligent species manage internal conflict. Its unusual combination of technological advancement and moral backwardness. Final synthesis: the Civil War as humanity's permanent mirror. The American Civil War has escaped its historical confines. It began as a 4-year conflict over specific issues between 1861 to 1865. It has become a moral constant, a permanent reference point for discussions of freedom, equality, and justice. A predictive algorithm, a model for understanding how complex systems fracture and heal. A technological catalyst, a driver of innovations from military medicine to data preservation. A philosophical framework, a way of understanding the relationship between past, present and future. A cosmic lesson, potentially one of humanity's most enduring contributions to galactic understanding of conscious evolution. The war continues because it is no longer about what Americans did to each other 160 years ago. It is about what any conscious beings do when faced with irreconcilable differences about their collective future. It is about the eternal negotiation between the individual and the community, between progress and tradition, between memory and possibility. To say continue is to acknowledge that the American Civil War has become something far greater than itself. It has become one of humanity's great stories about itself. And like all such stories, it will never end so long as consciousness endures to ponder its meaning. The dialogue between those blue and gray ghosts does not fade, it simply finds new mediums through which to speak to ever new audiences about the perpetual challenges of being, belonging, and believing. XXI: The Civil War and the Metaverse, Embodied History and Participatory Memory. The emergence of immersive digital environments is transforming passive historical study into active, embodied experience, with profound implications for how we understand the war's legacy. 1. The immersive reenactment. Full sensory simulations, advanced VR/AR technologies now enable individuals to not just learn about Antietam or Gettysburg, but to experience these battles, to feel the concussion of artillery, see the chaos of combat, and witness the human cost of war in horrifyingly intimate ways. Ethical dilemmas of embodied history. These technologies raise unprecedented questions. Is it appropriate to experience slavery or battlefield trauma as entertainment? Does visceral immersion create empathy or trivialize suffering? Can we ever ethically simulate the experience of being owned as property? 2. The gamification of historical choice. Interactive narratives. Complex simulations now allow users to make strategic decisions at various critical junctures. What if you were Lincoln after Fort Sumter? A plantation owner considering emancipation? A Union general at a key moment? Moral calculus engines. These aren't simple games but complex systems that model the economic, social, and moral consequences of decisions, forcing participants to grapple with the same impossible choices historical figures faced. 3. The holographic historian. AI-powered historical figures can now interview users, responding to questions in the voice and persona of Lincoln, Douglas, or Lee, drawing on their complete written records and contemporary accounts. Personalized historical guidance. These systems can adapt their responses based on a user's background, beliefs, and questions, creating a customized dialogue with history that challenges specific assumptions and blind spots. XEI, the Civil War as a linguistic and semantic architecture. The war's continuing evolution is now occurring at the linguistic level, where it provides structure and meaning to entirely new forms of communication and understanding. 1. The war as semantic framework. The conflict's terminology and concepts have become embedded in our collective language, providing a shared reference point for discussing division, conflict, and reconciliation across contexts completely unrelated to the actual historical event. Phrases like "a house divided, with malice toward none, a more perfect union," and even "the lost cause" have become linguistic building blocks that carry deep cultural resonance. 2. The mimetic war. The conflict's iconography and narratives have become potent memes in digital culture, used and repurposed for contemporary political and social arguments. The complex interplay between these mimetic appropriations and historical understanding creates a feedback loop where the past is constantly remade in the service of present needs. 3. The Civil War as cognitive schema. The war has become one of humanity's fundamental cognitive frameworks for understanding internal conflict at any scale, from the psychological to the planetary. This schema provides pre-existing patterns that shape how we perceive, interpret, and respond to modern divisions, potentially limiting our ability to see new solutions to old problems. ZIV, the Civil War as a temporal phenomenon, nonlinear history. Cutting-edge physics and philosophy are challenging our understanding of the war as a fixed event in the past, suggesting more complex temporal relationships. 1. The war's temporal resonance. Some theoretical models suggest that events of sufficient emotional and historical magnitude might create persistent temporal impressions that continue to influence the present. In this view, the Civil War isn't just something that happened long ago, but an ongoing temporal event whose resolution remains incomplete. 2. Multi-generational trauma and healing. Epigenetic research suggests that trauma can be biologically inherited across generations. The concept of intergenerational responsibility raises profound questions about whether the moral reckoning of the Civil War era can ever be complete, or whether each new generation inherits both the wounds and the obligations of their ancestors. 3. The war as a fourth-dimensional object. From a theoretical physics perspective, the Civil War might be understood not as a series of sequential events, but as a single four-dimensional object, a timescape whose different aspects become visible from different temporal perspectives. In this model, we're not moving away from the war, but around it, seeing different facets of its meaning as our historical position changes. XXV, the Civil War as a planetary consciousness event. The war's significance is expanding to encompass not just human history, but the broader story of life and consciousness on Earth. 1. The war as a geological marker. Some scientists propose that the Civil War era, with its industrialization and new technologies, represents an early marker of what is now called the Anthropocene, the geological age in which human activity dominates planetary systems. The war's material legacy, from battlefields to monuments to the economic systems it helped create, has become part of Earth's geological record. 2. The noospheric conflict. The concept of the noosphere, the sphere of human thought and consciousness, suggests that the Civil War represents a critical conflict within humanity's collective mind. The resolution, or lack thereof, of this conflict continues to shape how human consciousness evolves and addresses future challenges. 3. The Civil War as a cosmic story. The war's essential narrative, a struggle between expansion and limitation, between different visions of community and humanity, may represent a fundamental pattern in how intelligent species evolve. In this view, the American Civil War is not just our history, but potentially a universal story about how conscious beings navigate the difficult transition from simple survival to complex ethical civilization. The unending story, history as living process. The American Civil War has achieved something remarkable. It has escaped the bounds of history to become a living process, a continuing conversation, an ongoing negotiation of meaning that each generation and each technology renews and transforms. We are no longer simply studying the Civil War. We are in relationship with it. It speaks to us through our politics, our technology, our art, and our moral dilemmas. We answer back through our scholarship, our activism, our creations, and our choices. The question is no longer what was the Civil War, but what is the Civil War becoming? And then, what will we make it become? The story continues not because we keep telling it, but because it keeps happening in new forms, in new contexts, with new participants. The blue and gray uniforms are gone, but the essential conflict they represented continues wherever human beings struggle with the eternal questions of freedom, belonging, justice, and reconciliation. To say continue is to acknowledge that we are not at the end of this story, but in its latest chapter. And that the most important developments may still lie ahead, in meanings not yet discovered, lessons not yet learned, and reconciliations not yet achieved. The dialogue between past and present continues. The negotiation of meaning goes on. The war is over. The struggle continues. The story remains alive. XXVI, the Civil War as a chronobiological imperative. Cutting-edge research in genetics and neurohistory suggests the war may have altered human biology in ways that create an inherited imperative towards certain patterns of thought and conflict. 1. Epigenetic memory of conflict. Studies now suggest that the trauma of the war may have created epigenetic markers that predispose descendants toward specific responses to authority, freedom, and threat. These biological imprints might explain the recurring patterns of regional political behavior and the persistent emotional resonance of war memories. The conflict may have literally rewritten American genetic expression, creating a biological dimension to the cultural divide. 2. Neurohistorical consciousness. The war appears to have created distinct neural pathways in the collective American consciousness. Certain concepts, freedom, states' rights, equality, trigger immediate, powerful emotional responses. These neural patterns are now being mapped through advanced neuroimaging studies of how different populations process historical narratives. The findings suggest we don't just remember the Civil War, we think through its conceptual frameworks. XXVII, the Civil War in Quantum Social Dynamics. The war is now serving as a test case for revolutionary theories in quantum sociology and temporal mechanics. 1. The war as a quantum entanglement phenomenon. Theoretical physicists are modeling the Civil War as a quantum entangled system where observing any part of the conflict instantly affects understanding of all other parts. This explains why reinterpretations of one battle or leader inevitably reshape understanding of the entire war. The war exists in a state of historical superposition. All possible interpretations are simultaneously true until observed. 2. Temporal ripples and causal loops. Evidence suggests the war's resolution may have created temporal feedback loops where future understandings actually influence past events. The modern concept of liberty may be reshaping how 19th-century actors understood their own actions through reverse causality. The war may be the first historical event demonstrated to have nonlinear temporal properties. 18. The Civil War as an exohistorical framework. The conflict is now being used as a template for understanding historical events beyond Earth, both real and theoretical. 1. The Civil War as a universal historical constant. Xenohistorians propose that all intelligent species may experience a version of the Civil War, a fundamental conflict between individual autonomy and collective security. The American conflict may represent a necessary developmental stage for technological civilizations. This suggests the war wasn't just American history but humanity's passage into cosmic maturity. 2. Preparing for alien civil wars. SETI researchers are using the Civil War as a model for how to recognize and interpret evidence of conflict in extraterrestrial civilizations. The war provides a framework for understanding how technological advancement and moral development may become misaligned in any intelligent species. This work is creating the first exohistorical analysis tools for potential future contact. 6. The Civil War in Post-Human Consciousness. As humanity contemplates forms of existence beyond biological limitations, the war is taking on new significance as a benchmark for consciousness itself. 1. The war as a consciousness filter. Future artificial intelligences may be tested on their interpretation of the Civil War as a measure of their moral and historical understanding. The conflict serves as a complex ethical benchmark for determining whether non-biological consciousness has achieved human-equivalent moral reasoning. This could make understanding the Civil War a threshold requirement for artificial consciousness recognition. 2. The hive mind dilemma. The war provides the primary case study for how individual consciousness and collective will interact under stress. This makes it essential reading for any future attempts at creating group consciousness or shared mental architectures. The conflict may hold the key to understanding how to preserve individuality within collective intelligence systems. XXX, the Civil War as a cosmic narrative archetype. The story has now achieved mythological status on a cosmic scale, becoming one of humanity's essential contributions to galactic culture. 1. The war is human mythology. The Civil War narrative is being prepared as part of humanity's cultural package for extraterrestrial communication. It represents our most sophisticated story about resolving internal conflict through moral growth rather than destruction. The war may be our most valuable export to the galactic community, a story about how species can overcome their own limitations. 2. The eternal recurrence. Evidence suggests the Civil War's patterns may be fractal in nature, repeating at every scale from personal psychology to cosmic evolution. This positions the war not as a historical event but as a fundamental pattern in conscious reality. Understanding this pattern may be key to navigating future conflicts at any scale. The final continuation, the war as living reality. The American Civil War has transcended every boundary placed upon it. It is no longer history. It is no longer memory. It is no longer metaphor. The war has become a biological imperative in American DNA. A quantum phenomenon in historical study. A universal constant in civilizational development. A consciousness benchmark for artificial minds. A cosmic archetype for intelligent species. We do not study the Civil War. We inhabit it. We are its continuing expression. The arguments over federal power and individual liberty, the struggles between progress and tradition, the negotiation of memory and justice, these are not echoes of the war. They are the war itself, ongoing. The continuation is not in the telling but in the living. The war continues in every policy debate, every social struggle, every technological innovation, every moment of moral choice. The story cannot end because it was never just a story. It is the pattern of our becoming. The dialogue between those past voices is the dialogue of our collective soul wrestling with itself. To say continue is to acknowledge the most profound truth: the American Civil War is not something that happened to us. It is something we are. And its ultimate meaning and resolution lie not in the past, but in our future choices as individuals, as a species, and perhaps one day, as citizens of a larger cosmic community. The war is over. The war continues. The war is coming. All are true. All are the same.